We are pleased to offer the second installment of Ron White's class, Lincoln in Private, Wisdom for Today. Ron, we are so grateful for your scholarship and your ability to articulate to us these nuggets of wisdom that are so refreshing to us and help us learn all the more, not just a historical perspective, but a perspective that we can take with us in our day and in our age. We are grateful, Ron, for your scholarship and the way in which you conduct yourself in that work. We are grateful for your presence as well, that in the midst of a sermon series over these weeks here at San Marino Community Church, we've been talking about friendship, and I can safely say that for those of us who've had the gift of getting to know Ron White, we not only are just amazed and grateful for his academic ability, but the way in which you conduct yourself as a friend of many. So thank you for being who you are, Ron, and thank you for being here yet again as we continue this series. My name is Pastor Eric Wiebe. I'm the associate pastor here at San Marino Community Church, and I'm grateful to have been entering my 6th month here in the presence of this congregation. I wasn't looking for a clap. That was just more information. When you see me make a mistake, you can say, "Well, he's new. He's allowed to make mistakes." It's a joy to host events like this. There will be more in the future. There have been many in the past. We're grateful for you coming out and for this being such a robust group. I'm no good at numbers, but look, we look like we're about 60, 70 people here. And what a gift to be regathered here in this season and to be learning and engaged in this way, in such faith-filled ways. So thank you for the way that you will take the information from today and utilize it in your journey of faith. And thank you for just being present to this kind of conversation where we deepen our understanding of God's work in our world today. So without further ado, Ron, welcome. We are glad that you are here.
Let me express my gratitude. In September of 2020, Jessica Von Lohr approached me and said, "Would you like to become scholar in residence of this congregation?" Other people said, "What is that?" What kind of title is that? But I've become kind of a mole in this congregation. I have watched with great appreciation. We have the most incredible staff, from ministers to directors to others. This is a vital, vibrant congregation, and many of us know that trying to respond and return from COVID has not been easy for any organizations. I spoke to the Pasadena Rotary on Wednesday, and we were talking about that same phenomenon. But it's been very difficult for churches, and this church has responded with great, great vibrancy. Let me also say that we made the decision to make this an in-person event, but not online right now. We wanted to get you out here in person, but it's been recorded. So I've talked over the last week with several people who did watch the first event. And if this is your first time here, you were at the Philharmonic or you were at your pre-Super Bowl party or wherever you were, we're grateful that you've come for this second one. Let me begin just with a little bit of review, so to speak. Where are we and what are we doing? What is Lincoln in Private? Lincoln had the most remarkable, unusual habit of writing little notes to himself. He never dated them, never titled them, and never signed them. He never thought we'd ever see them. They were for his eyes only. When he and Mary left Springfield to go to Washington for him to become the 16th president, she did what many people in the 19th century did. She went out in the back alley, and what she called her burn pile, she burned almost the entire correspondence between she and her husband. This is what people did. This was private. So I think maybe Lincoln might have burned some of these notes and or his son Robert Todd, who lived all the way till 1921, who was the custodian of his father's papers, might have looked at this and said, my gosh, we got all these papers, I can't save them all. These don't look to be very official, they're not even signed by my father. Perhaps he didn't let them go either. So we only have one note from the 1830s. This is where Lincoln moved to New Salem, Illinois, after living with his parents in Kentucky and southern Indiana. And when he moved to this tiny village, he slept in the back room of a store, or as a single man, young man, 21 years of age, he boarded with families 1 month, 1 month, 1 month. Not exactly the way that you could keep your notes together, so only one survives from the 1830s. I'm quite convinced he wrote many more because this was a lifelong habit. In the 1940s, only 6, maybe 7 have survived. Finally, in the 1850s, now he's already been elected to Congress. He's now become a very prominent Illinois lawyer. He's got a lovely home in Springfield, and now he begins to save these notes. But I think he wrote hundreds and hundreds of them. So my suggestion of the title of the book is, I think this shows a side of Lincoln that we may not see in the public Lincoln. His law partner, William Herndon, said Lincoln was, quote unquote, the most shut-mouthed man I have ever met. By that he meant he didn't reveal very much of his own personal feelings especially. He had grown up, as I said last week, in the Second Great Awakening, in Baptist churches that were very, very emotional, and he reacted against this. He determined, and he became an extremely rational person. So he didn't share who he was publicly, but I think he shares who he is privately in these notes. So last week we looked at 3 of them. The first was what we call the lyrical Lincoln. He took a trip to Niagara Falls, the great natural wonder of the United States in the early 19th century, long before Yellowstone, Glacier, Grand Canyon. And he wrote this remarkable lyrical piece that isn't typical of the way Lincoln writes. Then he offered notes for a lecture. We don't think he ever gave the lecture, but he talks about the fact that he learns as much in his moments of failure as in his moments of success. Wouldn't that be remarkable if we could say this? I mean, this was sort of suggested in Jessica's wonderful sermon this morning, that we could learn from our failure, not just our successes. And then the third is his remarkable soliloquy on slavery. This is the burden of the most remarkable set of notes. He's struggling with this great issue of slavery. So today we're going to move forward and look at 3 more notes. The first that I want to look at, and we bring this up on the screen now, this what I call the definition of democracy. Lincoln, we can bring that one up. So Mary Lincoln, who has been treated rather poorly by historians and biographers, I'm more sympathetic to her. As I've suggested, she lost her son Eddie in 1850, 3.5 years old. Her son Willie in 1862, 11 years old. Then her husband in 1865, and then her son Tad in 1868. Only one of her 4 children ever lived into adulthood. So in 1875, she was placed in an insane asylum in Batavia, Illinois. And out of that insane asylum, she struggled to be released. And Myra Bradwell, her lawyer, we talked about this a little bit, I want to talk about it some more. She gives to Myra Bradwell this fragment, this note from her husband. Let's look at it. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Lincoln begins his public speaking career when he moves from New Salem to Springfield by joining the Young Men's Lyceum Club. This was a club where young men could learn how to speak publicly and how to debate. And in his first speeches, not too surprising for people who are young, he's rather lengthy, rather verbose, even though he is quite profound. But as he moves forward, and this is something that can happen in maturity, he learns how less is more. And so here is this remarkable brief definition. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. But very unusual for most public speakers and writers, Lincoln likes to use the negative to accent the positive. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. In a very succinct way, he's describing what is American democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. We don't know how and why Mary was able to hold on to this fragment. As I said last week, when Lincoln was assassinated, David Davis, then a Supreme Court Associate Justice, a friend of Lincoln, instructed his two secretaries, Hay and Nicolay, collect all of President Lincoln's papers, and they all came together. And it's in those papers that we find most all of these notes. But this one, somehow Mary held on for herself and moved it forward. When Lincoln came home from that single term in Congress, I believe I said this last week, but let me emphasize it again because it says something to you and me. His law partner, William Herndon, said, we've got to start subscribing to various national newspapers, especially anti-slavery newspapers. And Lincoln said, yes, but we also need to subscribe to newspapers that have quite a different point of view. One from Richmond, Virginia, one from Charleston, South Carolina. And Herndon, taken aback, said, well, why in the world would we do that? He said, because we need both sides at the table. Both sides at the table. Do we have both sides at the table? So in the midst of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, I'll get it right, Lincoln starts reading this book by a man by the name of Frederick Ross. Frederick Ross was minister of the First Presbyterian Church of Huntsville, Alabama. I traveled to the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia to try to learn more about this Presbyterian minister. He wrote a book called Slavery Ordained by God. Slavery Ordained by God. It had such a wide circulation that it was reviewed in London, England, and it became kind of a bestseller among those who trumpeted pro-slavery theology. So even in the midst of 7 debates with Stephen Douglas, Lincoln is reading this book. Let's put up on the screen now. I will learn how to use the clicker. For today, we don't have the original manuscript, but I want to have the transcription because it's quite a long transcription. Let's kind of look at it together and think about what Lincoln is saying. Suppose it is true that the Negro is inferior to the white in the gifts of nature. That's what Frederick Ross is arguing. Suppose it is true. Suppose it is true. Is it not the exact reverse justice that the white should, for that reason, take from the Negro any part of the little which has been given to him? Yesterday, as I'm now doing every Saturday, I had a 1-hour conversation with Gary Demarest. Gary's 97 years old. And he recounted to me that in his first call to ministry, he served at a Riverside Presbyterian Church in Jacksonville, Florida. Nancy Mackey's here, who grew up in Jacksonville. And there he encountered this incredible dichotomy. People who were so gracious. They were Southerners, they were gracious, they were hospitable, until you raised the question of African Americans. And then their response was, they don't have the capacity. They will never have the capacity. They will never be able to be citizens of our country. So one Saturday, Gary went to a matinee by himself at a theater in downtown Jacksonville. And when he told me this, when he came out of the theater, there was a man dressed in white handing out Ku Klux Klan literature. He didn't have a hood on. And when he looked at the man, he was an elder in the Riverside Presbyterian Church. And they eyed each other. This is exactly what is being said here. Suppose it is true that the Negro is inferior to the white in the gifts of nature. Is it not the exact reverse justice that the white should, for that reason, take from the Negro any part of the little which has been given to him? Give to him that is needy is the Christian rule of charity, but take from him that is needy is the rule of slavery. The sum, and now Lincoln has been reading Frederick Ross's book, The sum of pro-slavery theology seems to be this: slavery is not universally right, not universally wrong. It is better for some people to be slaves. Notice how he underlines these key words. And in such cases, it is the will of God that it be such. The will of God. Now watch what Lincoln does with the will of God. Certainly there's no contending against the will of God, but still there is some difficulty in ascertaining and applying it to particular cases. For instance, we will suppose that the Reverend Dr. Ross has a slave named Sambo. And the question is it the will of God that Sambo shall remain a slave or be set free? Do you just get the way that Lincoln is thinking himself into this issue? The Almighty gives no audible answer to the question, and his revelation, the Bible, gives none, or at most none, but such as admits of a squabble as to its meaning. No one thinks of asking Sambo's opinion on it. I mean, the whole question, does Sambo, we may not like that use of the word, but does an African American have any agency? Does this person have any initiative in answering the question? So at last it comes to this, that Dr. Ross is to decide the question. And while he considers it, he sits in the shade with gloves on his hands and subsists on the bread that Sambo is earning in the burning sun. If he decides that God wills Sambo to continue a slave, he thereby retains his own comfortable position. But if he decides that God wills Sambo to be free, he thereby has to walk out of the shade, throw off his gloves, and delve for his own bread. I just find this absolutely compelling. Will Dr. Ross be actuated by that perfect impartiality which has ever been considered the most favorable to correct decisions? How does one decide difficult ethical questions? Now, I suggested last week that when Lincoln writes, he often speaks out loud. He was invited in 1863 to give a speech in Springfield, Illinois. In June of that year, there had been a great peace rally. Let's return the nation as it was with slavery. In September, there was to be a rally in favor of the Union. And people wanted Lincoln to come, but he calculated how difficult it would be to travel by train from Washington, D.C. to Springfield. It probably would be 2 or 3 trains just to get there. And finally, he decided he couldn't do it. So he wrote a letter, a speech, so to speak, to these people. There were 70,000 people who came to the rally, and the speech was read 7 times from 7 or 8 speaking stands, where 8,000 or 9,000 people would gather around the stand. But one of his secretaries happened to be there when he was writing the speech, and he said Lincoln would speak out loud. And he'd get really upset and really angry because the speech is really angry. And Lincoln just was filled with this, and then he wrote it all down. So I can imagine that Lincoln is not just sort of sitting there quietly writing this thing out, but he's really caught up in the ethical dilemma of this. Now watch what happens, and watch the punctuation. But slavery is good for some people, ! As a good thing, slavery is strikingly peculiar in this: that is the only good thing which no man ever seeks the good of for himself. Nonsense. Wolves devouring lambs, not because it is good for their own greedy maws, but because it is good for the lambs! I call this chapter the outraged Lincoln. But Lincoln takes the time to read the pro-slavery book, to try to understand the argument. I find it difficult sometimes to read a book which I don't think I'm going to like this point of view. I may not agree with this author, but Lincoln, better than us, takes the time to try to understand what Dr. Ross, Presbyterian minister, he spoke at the General Assembly of the then Southern Church, of the Northern Church. He was a well-known person, and Lincoln reads his book. Okay. To me, the most fascinating question of all about Abraham Lincoln is, what was his faith? Was he a Christian? What did he believe? My first encounter with Lincoln, teaching a class at UCLA, was engaging the second inaugural address. And I was so taken by it that in 701 words, Lincoln mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, and invokes prayer 3 times. This is not the Lincoln that is usually presented in a biography or in a history book, a story of the Civil War. And I wanted to know more. Where did this come from? Well, I think where it comes from, and now we'll go to the next slide, is this remarkable document. At the end of August 1862, the Union suffered yet another disastrous defeat. This was called the Second Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run. The first Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, occurred in 1861. People rode out to Manassas, about 25 miles southwest of Washington. They rode out in their carriages. They took their picnic baskets. They were expecting the North to have this great victory. It didn't turn out that way at all. The South overwhelmed the Northern Army with less men, and the Army and the picnic baskets all skedoodled back to Washington, D.C. Now in 1862, they fought another battle at Manassas, or Bull Run. When I say Manassas or Bull Run, the North had one understanding. Bull Run was the name of the small river. Manassas was the name of the place, and they protected to name it by different names if you were south or north. So the North suffers another defeat. Lincoln calls an emergency cabinet meeting. At that cabinet meeting, one of his secretaries wrote later, the Attorney General, that Lincoln said he was so overcome with grief that he felt like hanging himself. He felt like hanging himself. We believe that then he sat down and wrote this remarkable document. Lincoln in private, no one on March 4, 1865, when Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address, had any idea that Lincoln had already 2.5 years before began to think out for himself, debate within himself, where is God in the midst of the Civil War? So this document, I think, is the most incredible. The first time I ever encountered a fragment, teaching at UCLA, I had some meeting, I guess it was in Boston, and I went to Providence, Rhode Island, and I walked into the John Hay Library. John Hay was his young secretary, 22 years of age. John Hay would become Secretary of State as an old man in 1905 under Theodore Roosevelt. The library was named the John Hay Library because John Hay was a graduate of Brown University. And they wouldn't probably let me do it today, but way back there and then, the curator let me hold in my hands this piece of blue-lined paper with this document written on it. I was just blown away. Let's look at it together. The will of God prevails. Declarative statement. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. He understands because people have been coming to him, both ministers and politicians, to say, in effect, God is on our side, God is on our side, God is on our side. But he knew they were coming to Jefferson Davis to say, God is on our side, God is on our side. Both may be, and notice how he underlines this word, both may be and one must be wrong. Lincoln was a master of deductive reasoning. This is, I think, part of his training as a lawyer, to think very logically about this. Well, God cannot be on both sides at the same time. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. He's just kind of reasoning this out. He's thinking this out. The interesting question is, how long did he take to write this? I don't think he just No, I think he's thinking it out. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. And then I think this sentence is worth everything of Abraham Lincoln. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet, the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. For those of us as Christians and as Presbyterians, I think we have this delicate balance, do we not, that God acts, and yet we act. God acts through our actions. And in a sense, Lincoln is saying this right here. He's been listening to James Smith, Presbyterian minister, First Presbyterian Church, Springfield. He's been listening to Phineas Densmore Gurley, Presbyterian minister, New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. This didn't all come to himself out of the blue. He's been listening to this kind of theology. God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. Yet the human instrumentalities working just as they do are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. I have puzzled for a long time over that sentence, and I've sort of asked myself the question, what's the emphasis in this sentence? Is it, I'm almost ready to say this is probably true that God wills this contest? Or is it perhaps I am almost ready to say this is probably true that God wills this contest? See, the one thing about Lincoln, he's not an arrogant person. I think he really wants to discern the will of God, but he's never going to be so arrogant as to say, and I know exactly what it is. He's searching, he's discerning what is the will of God. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. Well, he is supposed to be bringing this war to a close. That's his role as commander-in-chief. He's being criticized daily for the fact that this war keeps going on. After what everybody thought would be 3 to 6 months, the North would win this war. We're now asking the question, what is happening in Ukraine? Will this war go on? Should we have a negotiated settlement? Should the Ukrainians have the right to reclaim everything, including Crimea? Should we make that decision? Do they get that decision? I mean, that's the kind of contemporary question that Lincoln is struggling with. By his mere quiet power. Isn't that an interesting adjective? By his mere quiet power. You see, I suggested last week that in the Second Great Awakening in the Baptist churches his parents attended, I don't have anything against Baptists, but the Baptist churches in those days were very, very emotional. And Lincoln would come out of those services at age 8 or 9, and he'd stand up on a stump, and he'd repeat the minister's sermon almost word for word with all the gesticulations that were going on until his father hit him on the backside and told him to stop that and get on home. Lincoln didn't like a noisy God. He never wore his faith on his sleeve. God for him was a person of great, immense power, but quiet. I had a funny story, if I may share this with you, in the different experiences of speaking in churches. Some years ago, I was invited to speak at a Presbyterian church in Orange County. And the person who invited me said, well, it would be wonderful if you could come down on Saturday and we could have a dinner together with some of the leaders, some of the elders of the church. So I said, well, I'd be happy to do that. So as I was leaving the dinner, the associate minister came up to me and she said, by the way, she said, would you also be willing to give the children's sermon tomorrow? I should have been more thoughtful. I said, sure. So I'm walking into the morning service and she says to me, you haven't forgotten that you're giving the children's sermon, have you? I had. So I thought, oh my goodness, I can give the sermon, but the children's sermon? What am I going to say? So I told this story that Lincoln worshiped at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. And a reporter from the Sacramento Daily Union Noah Brooks, had just arrived in Washington. He had met Lincoln once before in Illinois. And Brooks, kind of late for the service that morning, sat in the balcony. And when the minister said, let us pray, Brooks did something that he shouldn't have done. He had his eyes open, and he looked down at the ground floor, and everybody was like this, except one person who was 6 feet 4 inches tall and who was standing as the minister said, let us pray. So when the service was over, Noah Brooks went up to President Lincoln, and he said to him, pardon me, sir, I hope it's not too rude, but I happened to watch your posture while the minister called us for pastoral prayer, and I noticed that you stood, everybody else sat or even almost bent over in almost a kneeling posture. Why did you do that? Well, he said, I always think of God as the Almighty. So he said, my standing was a mark of respect. Let us pray, let us stand in remark of respect. Whew, I got through the children's sermon. So when the service was over, you stand at the back and you're greeting people on the way out, and this woman comes running up to me and she says, you'll never guess what happened. What happened? Well, she said, we went to children's church, and when I said, let us pray, they said, let's stand up, let's stand up. So Lincoln had this remarkable, what we might call a high view of God. God was almighty. And in this particular case, God was a person of quiet power on the minds of the now contestants. He could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Well, Lincoln, the public Lincoln, wasn't about to say God could give the final victory to either side. You mean you think God might be able to give the victory to the Confederacy as much as the Union? Yet the contest proceeds. I think this is the most remarkable document. We're all on a journey, and to me this is really central to Lincoln's theological journey. In the book, which I call Chapter 10, The Theological Lincoln, I then line up the Meditation on the Divine Will and the Second Inaugural Address. And I show that one is the foundation of the other. This is much more a philosophical, really theological document. When we get to the Second Inaugural, we're talking about the blood and the lash and the real energy and emotion, but one precedes, one is the foundation of the other. So what are we saying about Lincoln in private? What does this show us that perhaps we don't see fully in the public Lincoln? I'm not saying it's not in the public Lincoln. We see here a very thoughtful person, a very contemplative person. He's really using these notes, I think, to debate within himself. Most of them, this may be partial exception, are not going to be seen again in some public speech later on. This is simply his own way of thinking together. But I think this shows us, even in a more remarkable way, this man of yet 1 year of formal education, how he's willing to think through these events. And so I guess the question for you and me is, are we? We're bombarded. Cynthia and I keep making a vow. We're not going to watch all that television news. We're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. And then we're sucked in again. Do we have the time? Do our young people have the time to think with the social media, with the phones? The story this past week in both the PBS and the New York Times of the problems of young teenage girls facing incredible rates of suicide and depression and anger. And yet I just ordered this remarkable book by Richard Reeves of the Brookings Institution of Boys and Men, and the problem of boys in our society, falling way behind, cheering for the girls, but falling way behind girls in terms of their educational attainment. He recommends that boys should start school 1 year later than girls to be able to move forward in their own lives. Lincoln here is a model of what it means to be a thoughtful person. He doesn't in any way suggest he has all of the answers, but he's taking the time to think through these life-changing questions. You may ask, I'll answer the question now, is there anything in here about Mary and the boys? No. These notes, maybe he burned them, but these notes are not about his personal life. They're not about his marriage. They're not about his sons. They're really about the great issues that he's facing and how he's going to work his way into coming to those right decisions. This is what they're all about. We haven't even gotten to the public presidency of Lincoln. Let me just share one example before we draw to a close and get your questions and comments. In 1862, the Republican National Committee met in New York City. They determined, 1864, and they determined that Abraham Lincoln could not would not win re-election. They wrote to him and said, you will lose New York, you will lose Pennsylvania, you will lose your own state of Illinois. You cannot, will not be reelected. Lincoln sat down and wrote a note. When we are defeated for reelection, isn't this remarkable in the time in which we live? It will be our duty to cooperate with a new president that our nation might be saved. He then took that note to his cabinet that very afternoon, and he asked them to all sign the back of the note, verifying that he had written this note. I was privileged to see it in the kind of the vault of the Library of Congress where they have the Holy of Holies. This is one of the Holy of Holies documents. Well, what happened? Sherman took Atlanta. 2 weeks later, everything changed. McClellan was the opponent of Lincoln. He was for peace, the nation as it was, the Democrat, and Lincoln overwhelmingly won re-election, overwhelmingly won the soldiers' vote. When the Democrats thought by nominating McClellan they would win the soldiers' vote, Lincoln won almost 75% of the soldiers' vote. He was so respected. So we could go on and on and on, but I think it's time for me to stop and to begin to answer your comments and questions and to hear your comments and questions. It's been fun to do so a little bit this week. Thank you very much. Let me answer one question that was asked before we started this afternoon. The person said, what again were the casualty rates in the Civil War and how might that compare to what could have happened today? 750,000 dead in a nation of 35 million. So I made the suggestion, the calculation last Sunday, that if you said we are a nation of 350 million, that would mean if we had such a war today, be 750 million dead. I don't know anyone who was killed in Afghanistan or Iraq. As tragic as it was in a few thousands of deaths. Obviously a very different medical system to save people's lives. But the tragedy that affected that nation at that time, everybody knew a father, husband, son, brother who had been killed in the Civil War. Your comments or questions? Yes, Nancy.
Ron, would you mind talking a little bit about this last note? What is the difference between his assuming or speculating that maybe God willed this, which meant they really didn't, they weren't agents of the end? That and fatalism.
Okay.
Fatalism says it's determined already and we're just kind of following through. What's the difference in what Lincoln said?
Thank you, Nancy. The question is there a difference or what is the difference between fatalism, what is meant to be is going to happen regardless, and what Lincoln is saying here? This is a very interesting question. When I first delved into studying Abraham Lincoln, the consensus among the presidential historians and biographers was that Lincoln was part of fatalism. Whatever will be, will be. Kind of almost, I call it a kissing cousin of deism. Deism is if there's a God, God is kind of a clockmaker God in the sky, but does not enter into history. But then I read a book by a man named Francis Wharton, written in 1847. He was an Episcopal minister. He would become one of the first professors at the new Episcopal Seminary in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Wharton makes the point that fatalism is an enemy of the Christian faith because the Christian faith is based in providence. Providence is our belief in a loving God, a God with personality who does enter into history. And so, yes, Lincoln probably was a fatalist as a young man. Remember I said last week he rejected the Christian faith. He rejected that emotional experience as a youth. He writes a paper in New Salem criticizing what he called, quote unquote, revealed religion. But then as life tumbled in, the death of Eddie, the death of Willie, the Civil War. He's forced to rethink his faith, and he begins to attend more regularly than ever before the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. And I've read the sermons of Phineas Densmore Gurley on deposit at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia, and Gurley was preaching providence. He wasn't preaching fatalism. So Lincoln will say in the second inaugural address, in the providence of God. So I want to push against the tradition that, well, fatalism, determinism, it's all one direct plane. No, it isn't. Fatalism is one understanding of reality. Providence, for those of us who believe in God and Jesus Christ, is a very different understanding. And by the time Lincoln gets to the second inaugural, he has changed his mind. It's like he comes out and says, this is what I want to believe. People were so surprised by this address because he had never said this before publicly. He said it right here in this document we just looked at, but no one had ever heard Lincoln speak quite in these terms before. For whatever reason, he then gets a reply from Thurlow Weed, one of the great politicians, Republican politicians in New York, who commends him for the speech. And Lincoln writes back and says, well, the speech was not immediately popular. And then he went on to tell Reed, he said, men do not like to be told that their way is not God's way. Men and women do not like to be told that their way is not God's way. This guy's got it. Okay, other comments or questions? Yes?
This is not totally a fair question, but
I've been asked a lot of not fair questions.
could you comment about whether Lincoln's position has been changed by his severe depression after the death of his son?
Very, very good question. Could I comment upon the fact, did Lincoln's position change because of his severe depression after his son's, Willie's, death? A wonderful book by Joshua Schenck is called Lincoln's Melancholy. And Joshua Schenck, who's not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, interviewed a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists. I've had psychiatrists, a couple of them come up to me, and they said, many of us suffer from depression. But depression is actually, in some ways, the person who feels very deeply, not simply their own pain, but the pain of others. Women suffer from depression about twice as much as men. I think women are often much better attuned to the feelings of others than men. So the question then becomes, how are you going to deal with this? Are you going to simply become a poor me, which is understandable? Or are you going to say, I need to sort of deal with, here we now have Senator Fetterman checking himself into a hospital for depression. And the big columns that are going on, my goodness, is this something that he should announce to the world? Can we now, in our day and age, say, this is my condition? Are we going to look down upon him? Are we going to say, this takes a lot of courage for him to do this? So I think in some ways, I would suggest that Lincoln learned from his depression. It allowed him to become a more sensitive person to the pain of others, as well as the pain within himself. Now, Mary suffered incredible pain, but the way she wanted to answer that pain was to conduct a series of seances within the White House. And Lincoln went to one seance and he said, I'm sorry, I can't do this. I don't believe this. So he had to depart from Mary, who just somehow wanted to connect with Willie, even though Willie was dead. Yeah. Yeah.
That would be a pretty good undergraduate thesis.
A pretty good undergraduate thesis. Thank you. The bright lights I'm looking at. I'm sure you have more comments or questions. Oh, yes.
I guess considered common knowledge, the cause of the revolution had to do with taxation and money and control. But would you say that the Civil War the causes of the Civil War are that simplistic, that slavery caused the Civil War, that if it were not for slavery, the Civil War would have never been fought?
Ah, okay. The question, maybe the beginning of your comment was a lot of people, this is often, you hear this in the South, that the cause of the Civil War was economic. But your question, larger question, is would the Civil War have ever been fought without slavery? Let's remember what Lincoln tried to do. The problem of the Civil War for Lincoln was that there were 4 border states. One of those was Kentucky, where he grew up. So in the summer of 1862, he got the 4 border states together. And he said, here's my deal. I'll compensate you for your slaves. In fact, I'll allow you to take until 1895 to liberate all your slaves, and I'll pay you for every single slave that you liberate. And they said, no deal. And at that point, Lincoln decided that this could not continue. And so he sits down and for the first time begins to tease out in his own mind an Emancipation Proclamation. So he grew up in a generation that believed that slavery would become extinct. And even people in the South believed that. But then when the cotton gin came in and cotton became a great staple of Southern agriculture, they began to defend it, not simply economically, but as I suggested today, they began to attend it biblically or from the point of the Christian faith. So Lincoln finally comes to the place in his great House Divided speech, this nation cannot remain half slave and half free. What had happened in the Compromise of 1820 and 1850, every time I'm writing this biography of this incredible character in Maine, and Maine thought they would simply enter as a free state in 1820. Oh, no, no, no. You will only be able to enter if Missouri's entered as a slave state, so we'll have got to keep it equal. The South recognized that it wasn't going to remain equal. Lincoln believed it could not be half free and half slave. So I think the Civil War, in one sense, was almost inevitable, and yet in the other sense, people said, well, we've had these crises before and we've never come to this point. We came to that point in 1861. It is, as you suggest, I think, in your question, a very complicated, complex question and issue. Yeah. Oh, yes.
I'm just curious, with the loss of 750,000 men, what was the economic trend for the next 20 years?
Boy, I tell you. With a loss of 750,000 men, what would that do? Again, can you imagine what this is going to do to Ukraine in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, even if they are successful? The loss of all the flowering of their male generation? I'm trying to think of her name, but the wonderful former president of Harvard has written about this. And she's talked about what this did to the nation. For years and years, almost 100 years, we thought the figure was 619,000 men. And then someone did a demographic study, and they said, well, let's see, these men were very young. They were alive in 1860. They're not alive in 1870. It's now 750,000 men. You can imagine what that did to a nation with all of those men, mostly young men, no longer present. It was very, very damaging to this country. It really was, yeah. Good question. Yes?
Sometimes it's hard to believe that you didn't meet and talk with Abraham Lincoln because you know so much about him, but I don't think that would be possible. So my question is, if he were here, what would you ask him?
The question is, if he were here, what I ask him? A great tactic in college classes would be to, you sort of ask your students, if you could have dinner with 3 or 4 people that we talked about in class this semester, who would you invite and what would you talk about? Well, in a kind of a facile way, I would say, why did you keep McClellan on so long? I would also want to ask him, I've thought of writing a book on this, but I probably won't, but as Lincoln is traveling for 13 days from Springfield to Washington, 4 different times he speaks of himself as a humble instrument. A humble instrument. When he speaks to the legislators in Trenton, New Jersey, the House and Senate of the state of New Jersey, he said, I want to be a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty and this almost chosen nation. Almost chosen nation. We're having all this big debate about American exceptionalism and no. What did he mean by almost? I think I know. You know, I think slavery is, that's the almost in our society and continues on. I spoke the other day to the Jonathan Breakfast Club. This has been a week of busy speaking, and we were talking about the different way that Germany treats its past and the way we treat our past. And this young man, fairly young, came up to me and he said, by the time I was in the 5th grade, I had gone to 3 concentration camps. It is absolutely required for every school child in Germany to go to a death camp. You cannot make the excuse in Germany, I was not born then. You cannot say it's not my responsibility. This is our nation, it is our responsibility, and it will perpetually be our responsibility. And every child will go to a death camp, that they will understand the enormity of the evil of their nation. So I would like to ask Lincoln, what did he mean by almost? That would be a question. Oh, I got a lot of other questions asked too, but that's enough. Some more comments or questions. Doesn't have to be on Lincoln in private. It could be on any topic of Lincoln. You're thinking. Yes?
Yesterday's Wall Street Journal carried a review of a new book on on Lincoln, focusing on his nomination, and talked about the fact that he benefited from having the convention in Chicago, Illinois, when Seward had expected it to be in New York City. But the thing that I'm curious about is he had not apparently been a very successful politician from between the time that he failed to go back to the Congress and also apparently failed twice in run for Senate.
Right.
How did he ever get elected?
The comment is there's a book, I haven't seen it yet, in yesterday's Wall Street Journal reviewed about Lincoln's election, and the point being that the convention was held in Chicago, and Seward, who was the leading candidate, governor and senator from Illinois, wanted to be held not in Chicago. And what Lincoln's followers did was they were really smart. They figured out, it was called the wigwam. This was a huge tent. And they figured out that they knew where the Seward votes were. So they had control of the seating policy. And they'd put some Seward votes here and other Seward votes there. They didn't want them to connect with each other. They didn't want them to be able to communicate. There were no text messaging going on at that time. And so they managed the seating. And Lincoln came up with the idea that I'm not the leading candidate, but if I can simply say to people, if you don't really finally want to elect Seward, this would happen on the 3rd ballot, I'm here also. I'm not going to badmouth Seward. He's a remarkable person. This is what I'm going to do. But to say that he was not a successful politician, yes and no. He'd been elected 4 times to the Illinois legislature, 1 time to the United States Congress. As I suggested last week, the debates with Stephen Douglas, although he lost that race, he was very shrewd, he got the debates published. And everybody was reading these debates and they came away very impressed with him. Then in 1860, he was invited to come to New York City and to speak at was originally Henry Ward Beecher's Plymouth Congregational Church in Brooklyn, but that didn't work out, so he spoke at the Cooper Union in Midtown Manhattan. And here all the intellectuals, all the business leaders, all the political leaders arrived to see who was this guy. You know, he wasn't very well dressed. His clothes were kind of not pressed. His hair was sort of a mess. But when he began to speak, And he had a very shrewd message. His message was, according to Stephen Douglas, the founders of our nation never outlawed, never spoke against slavery, according to Stephen Douglas. And then he took document and meeting and convention and on and on and on to show the Northwest Territory, 5 states in the upper Midwest. The rule was slavery will not be permitted in the Northwest Territory. Well, who voted for this? The very people, many of them who had founded the American Constitution. It was a brilliant speech. So he began to earn this kind of trust as an intellectual, as a politician. And he was a very shrewd, his idealism should not diminish the fact that he was a shrewd machinery politician. He kept track of where every vote was. When he began to run for political office, he'd write letters to all these people. I remember you, I remember you. He wrote it all down. So yes, he was not, but maybe he was. And so Lincoln was actually very much esteemed in New England and in New York and in Pennsylvania. And he rose to that position. You could say it was a surprise. He won on the 3rd ballot.
Didn't sound like a surprise in the book, but
Yeah. No, but I take the comment and I take the book. You could argue it both ways, but it wasn't that he was kind of a total surprise. He had already become a well-known person. Thank you. Yeah.
If I'm getting my dates right, he signed off on the Transcontinental Railroad
Right.
during the time of the Civil War.
Yes.
And it seems to me that all of his resources should have been spent trying to defeat the South and not moving west.
The comment is if Lincoln signs off on the Transcontinental Railroad during the Civil War, and your comment is that perhaps he should have spent all of his resources on defeating the South and not building the railroad. Let me drop back a speck. When Lincoln was elected, the Capitol was being built. And the argument was, well, my gosh, we can't continue to build this Capitol. First of all, we don't have the manpower anymore. We don't have the money. We should stop. And Lincoln says, no, we're not going to stop. We're going to keep building this Capitol building, the huge dome, because this will demonstrate that this union is going on. It's going forward. It will be there in the next century. We will continue to build this Capitol. What a smart move to do. So Lincoln understood that the real gravity of this nation was moving west, and that the Transcontinental Railroad would be extremely important in allowing the nation to expand. He was a fan of railroads, but he wanted to push this. So even though the Civil War was very important, and even though he had to fund it, he wanted, in a sense, to say, but we're going to move on. We're going to win this war, and the nation will continue to grow and expand. I think that was his vision. Yeah. Yes, Joanne.
How did Lincoln relax? Did he have any hobbies or anything?
How did Lincoln react? Did he have any hobbies? Relax. Well, Lincoln growing up was a wrestler. In fact, when he first came into New Salem, the Clary Mountain Boys were the terror of the region. And he took on their leader and defeated him in a wrestling match. He was big, 6 feet 4 inches tall. Today he'd be 6 feet 9 inches tall, given the fact that people were much smaller in the 19th century. He loved to play a kind of an early form of baseball. You know, he would kind of boast. He'd take a very, very strong axe and he'd hold it up like that and just show how strong he was, you know. He loved to play with children, and the children in the neighborhood loved him. His children had goats in the White House. They had all kinds of animals in the White House. He probably wasn't a very disciplinarian father. That was left to Mary, but he was a very indulgent father, a very loving father. So he was a very athletic person, very fit person, and he prided himself in that. Yeah. Yes.
Obviously, speeches are to die for. But he apparently had a very, fairly thin, reedy public speaking voice.
Oh,
It was not,
yeah.
public speaking by all rights was not his bag.
Very good. The comment is that for all of the, just acclaim of Lincoln, did he not have a very strange kind of speaking voice? Yes, he did. You might have thought that this tall man had a bass speaking voice, but actually he had a high tenor speaking voice. And people commented upon this in newspaper articles. But even when he gave that Cooper Union speech, I don't think I can actually exemplify it, but he would start speaking and then he would just kind of go like this and wander along. But it was really beguiling. He had learned in small town America how to speak to people in this way, how to get eye contact with them, how to communicate with them. And people fell in love with Lincoln because they recognized here was a person of integrity, a person of compassion, a person who cared about them. Lincoln had to learn early in his life. I want to be careful. I have to be very careful that I don't just go overboard about this man. Early in his career in Springfield, one day he learned that a man was trashing the Whig Party. The Whigs were the predecessors of the Republicans. So Lincoln rushed over, and this man was speaking there and he was trashing the Whigs. And Lincoln noticed that the man had some sort of physical disability, some sort of affliction. He was shaking a bit like that. So Lincoln got up and began to be the same. And the man was overcome with tears. He was overcome with shame by what Lincoln did. And he rushed out of the room. Lincoln had to apologize. The young Lincoln could be hurtful with his satire, could be harmful with his humor. Sometimes that's part of being young. And Lincoln had the magnanimous Lincoln that we think of in the Civil War, magnanimous towards the South in the Second Inaugural. That was a Lincoln who had to grow into that. That wasn't necessarily the Lincoln who was 25 years old or 30 years old. He could be hurtful in his comments. Yeah. Any more comments or questions? Well, the purpose of what we're doing is simply to suggest, pardon me. I can't hear it. Yes.
I've never heard anything about Mary's influence on Abraham and Abraham's influence on Mary.
I'm glad you asked that question. Yes. She said she's never heard anything about Mary's influence on Abraham or Abraham's influence on Mary. One reason I believe Mary deserves far more credit than she usually receives is she was better educated than he was. Girls were not normally as well educated as boys, but she was. Her father was one of the leading citizens of Lexington, Kentucky. She could speak French. She had quite an education for a young girl of her time. And therefore, when she married Abraham Lincoln, although some of her relatives thought she was marrying beneath herself, and in one sense she was, he didn't have the kind of stature that she did. But she saw in him his great gifts, his great abilities. She became his counselor. She became his confidant. And she knew, I think even before he did, that he had tremendous possibilities as a politician. And so she was proud of him and she pushed him. Was she a difficult person? She might have been a difficult person. But I don't give Lincoln great credit for being out on that 8th Judicial Circuit, which I talked about last week, being away from home for 180 to 200 days a year, leaving Mary simply to become literally a single mother to raise all these boys. That wasn't very good of him. So when he got in trouble with her or when she got angry, he would just walk out of the house and go down to his law office. But how can anybody get inside anybody else's marriage and to know what if a marriage works or not? I don't think we can do that. But then Mary gets to Washington. And the women of Washington treat her as a Western rube. They don't treat her with respect. She's this woman from out there in Illinois. What does she know about the sophisticated people of Washington, D.C.? And she's not treated fairly or rightly. And then Lincoln, not in any way wishing to dismiss her as a counselor, his counselors become, believe it or not, William Seward and others who are his cronies and his friends, and in some ways she's sort of put aside. And then with the death of Willie, she never, ever overcomes that. For the rest of her life, she will dress in black. She can't even come to the memorial service for her son, conducted by Phineas Densmore Gurley in the White House, because she is so absolutely overcome by the tragedy of this boy, 11 years old. So, in a way, that also separates her from her husband. You know, in a sense, he says to her, Mary, this is awful. I share the same grief that you do, but we must move on. We must move on. That's sort of in the Lincoln movie, and I think that's very accurate. We must move on. So I think she deserves a lot more credit than she has traditionally received. Yeah. Well, you deserve a lot of credit for coming. There's a lot of options, as the airlines say, on a Sunday afternoon. At least we don't have to rush to the kickoff. But I'm grateful to the church that we, from time to time, as Eric has suggested, I think this is part of the genius and part of the real idea of this church, to put on again and again and again opportunities for us on a Sunday afternoon. I'm privileged to be a part of that. Thank you for coming.